very, very happy to have our own IEP alum, Valerie Termini, and her husband, Mike, in the back there, to come down from Davis to tell us all about natural resources in the California Fish and Game Commission. I also want to give a shout that Valerie is the first woman ever to be the ED of this organization. First California Fish and Game, first female president, maybe something like that. Okay, all right, I can sense a trend. We're really excited to have her. She worked a long time with Ocean Protection Council, really focused a lot on marine resources. Her job now is obviously not just marine resources, and she's going to talk about some of the terrestrial stuff, but as she's promised, she'll make the link. It's all connected, as she has told me, and so we'll see what the link is to the coastal systems. But let's give her a very warm welcome.
Thanks, everyone. It's really great to be back here. It's fun. We miss Monterey from time to time, but we also like the sun.
All right. Yeah, let's figure this out.
Oh, I see. No, I'm sorry, I just messed with it. It was perfect before.
No, that's too late. All right, yeah, why don't you stop and I'll do this one. All right, not that. Is that too dark? Okay.
I can read.
Okay, all right. Sit down.
All right, so I have a quick question for y'all, and it's not meant to alarm you. We're all going to circle back to the connectedness of everything, but how many of you eat meat? Just raise your hands. 5, all right. Great. How many of you hunt? 1, 2, 1.5, 3. How many of you eat seafood? How many of you fish? Or should I say, how many of you have a fishing license? I'm not going to bust anybody. All right, this is mostly for my education. I'll come back to this, but you know what? Tonight I want to focus on is talking about connections, and both our connection to the earth, but also our connection with the stuff that we eat. Freud coined a term about the narcissism of minor differences, and there's also a book that just was out that talks about this, and it's by Peter Baldwin. He talks about American exceptionalism. And you know, Americans are very vested in their identities, whether you're a Red Sox fan like me, so you automatically hate the Yankees, or you're a cat person or a dog person. We very strongly identify, even with like what kind of car you drive, that kind of defines us as people, right? And so I want to talk to us tonight about how I think we have to rethink how we do that and how we identify so strongly in one particular thing that is for the environment and what's happening with climate change. I think that's putting us more at risk of not seeing the bigger picture and how we're all actually more connected than we think we are. So, you know, my name is Valerie Termini, and I have a cool job. I wanted to talk a little bit about the coastal, not the Coastal Conservancy, where do I work, the Coastal Fishing Game Commission. And when I sort of was getting recruited for it, I was talking to the director of a big organization, and he was like, Val, it's all the wildlife in California. It's all the fish, it's all the plants, it's everything. And I was like, oh, that's a lot. And it is a lot. So if you don't know, California is one of the most biodiverse places in the lower 48. And this also goes out into the ocean as well. It's really unique, and it's really amazing, and it's, you know, a humbling opportunity to have that as sort of your jurisdiction. So if you don't know, the Fish and Game Commission has jurisdiction over pretty much every living thing in California, with aside from people, agriculture, and domestic animals. Specifically, the Commission is vested with the authority to regulate the take, the possession, and the conservation of birds, mammals, fish, amphibians, and reptiles. And basically, we do this from the Oregon border to the Mexican border, and from Nevada state line out 3 miles out into the ocean. The mission of the Commission is to ensure the long-term sustainability of California's fish and wildlife resources, for its ecological value as well as for its use and enjoyment by Californians. So those two things are important in mind. The commissioners themselves, there's 5 of them, they're appointed by the governor, and they're expected to make really complex public policy decisions and biological decisions. There's a staff of 10, which includes me, to make sure they have all the information to base those decisions. But then we also work with the Department of Fish and Wildlife. So this is getting mired into state lands and agencies. So the Fish and Game Commission is the regulatory agencies. Essentially, we make the regulations, and the Department of Fish and Wildlife manages them. So there's 3,000 staff there. So we draw on them a lot. But it's an important distinction to bear in mind that we're an independent organization. And fun side note, the California Fish and Game Commission was actually the first wildlife conservation agency in the United States. So 1870, we're celebrating our 150th year pretty soon. So at the commission, I sometimes feel like that fish in the middle there, stuck between 2 birds of prey, where we're being pulled in opposite directions. The fish in the middle is obviously sort of a metaphor for the scarcity of natural resources and how we make decisions around those resources in the middle of competing tensions. And rarely at the commission do we have an issue where there's wide agreement on how an issue should be handled. More often than not, we have issues with that brings together people with polar opposite viewpoints. And you know, most of the public are here, but they don't come to our meetings. Right? And that's okay. But you know, there's this old adage in government. I was talking about that with Michael today. When everyone's mad at you, you know that you're doing a good job. So I'm doing a good job, probably. So I have 3 stories I want to share with you today. I'm breaking them up into broad categories, and I can bring it all back to marine, and we can talk about marine net length. That's kind of my love and where I'm from, so we can go right there. But I wanted to break it up into fish, marine and coastal resources, and then wildlife. And one theme to bear in mind throughout all of this is the law. So in my first week at the commission, I got served my first legal suit. And it was surprising, but and it's something I know, the state gets sued all the time. But you know, here we are trying to balance the needs of Californians and the environment, hunters, animal rights activists, and you know, here's some conservation that's trying to sue us, and you know, we have 10 staff people. So the only thing to bear in mind with that is that those legal suits end up shaping environmental policy significantly. It has a huge impact on the policies and all the decisions that are made and how they end up getting shaped. And so regardless of this particular legal suit's outcome or anything, those legal challenges are really important to environmental policy and something to bear in mind as you go through school here. So we're going to start off with fish. And so I like fishing. I grew up fishing. And to be clear, I'm not so much as interested in catching things as I am by sitting by a lake and drinking beer. But it's part of our identity. It's part of my identity. I like to fish, right? So if you don't know, this is a striped bass, and it might not be a fish you know a lot about, but it's emblematic of a lot of the challenges we're facing here in California at the state. So a little bit of background, striped bass are an invasive East Coast species. They were brought here in 1879, 14 years after the Civil War, just to put that in your heads. Tens of thousands of anglers now fish for them each year throughout the Central Valley and the Delta, pretty much throughout the state, and they generate millions and millions of dollars in revenue. Stripers are also one of those species that have adapted really well to the Delta ecosystem that we've created. It's a generalist. It can eat, live, reproduce pretty much throughout the Delta ecosystem. Problematically, it eats salmon and steelhead, which you might know are critically endangered species. Recently, the Commission received a petition to increase the bag limits of striped bass and black bass. So the Commission has the ability to regulate these guys. We could up the take, we could totally say you can not take them at all. And so I bet if you don't know much about striped bass, you're thinking, great, let's get rid of an invasive species. So as you might imagine, the answer is not nearly that simple. This non-native predatory fish comprise a really much larger ecosystem. What kind of Delta ecosystem do we want to have for the future, and what's the vision that we have for a state, and what are those needs that we need to balance? There are a ton of questions. The scientific community would suggest there's a lot more going on with this species. Let's go back there. This is prettier, than just predatory behavior. So as salmon and steelhead numbers have gone down, so has striped bass numbers. They've gone down considerably as well. They also point out that if you remove one invasive species, what's going to happen? Another invasive species is probably going to fill in that void. Salmon and steelhead aren't necessarily going to be like, ooh, yay, we can reproduce our leather. If you look at the species that are there right now, the nearly 46 species spotted along the delta, about 27 were non-native. So it gives you some perspective. Science will also teach us that if you, and the other kind of big pink elephant in the room is that as salmon and steelhead species have declined, water regulators have regulated the water that's going down south, right? So the pumping stations at the Delta supply about 25 million Californians water and about 750,000 acres of irrigated farmland. So casualties in this tug of war are counted pretty much in fallow fields and the loss of species. As the drought has intensified, so has the debate about the Delta's ecosystem and how that limited supply of water should be apportioned. Farmers in the Central Valley will call it a man-made drought. If you drive down I-5, you'll see those signs. And they'll say that the water is needed for crops is going to fish instead. Last year, environmental groups sued us and the feds, claiming that endangered species were being sacrificed for agricultural interests. One of the many complaints is the decision to label striped bass as a game fish. And so this was done well before I was even born in the Fish and Game Code. And so, as I mentioned, the commission sets limits for striped bass. And so the recreational anglers can be cited if they catch more than 2 per day or if they keep any that are smaller than 18 inches. And some agricultural interests would like to see the limits on striped bass and other non-native predators totally removed. Again, this creates some practical challenges. This is the range of striped bass in California. So how many of you think fishing alone is going to help, right? So that's likely a futile proposition. And importantly, Central and Southern California need water too. It's a huge economic engine. There's roughly 25 million people in Central and Southern California, and it's some of the most lucrative farms in the country. And so again, there's that balance here. You have to figure out how to balance all of these with the science and do what's best for the future based and basing those decisions on sound science. It's not an easy thing to solve. It's going to take innovation, creative solutions, and people who are a little less smart than me to figure it out. But we also have to connect on what's important here. And I think we can all agree that water is really important and finite resource. And so we all have to figure out how to use it more efficiently. The commission, what we're going to do, the petition itself ended up being withdrawn by the petitioners, which were the agricultural interests at the meeting, but primarily because there is about 4,000 sports angling members that were coming to the meeting to protest it. But we're going to hold a forum in May to bring together the scientists, the water agencies, the users, the recreational anglers, the water users, everybody. And we're going to talk about predation, and we're going to talk about maybe some steps that would be helpful in actually moving this dialogue forward and getting to some concrete solutions. Why you're all here today, Nikki? Ocean and coastal races. So Jason mentioned prior to the commission, and I should say I've only been at the commission for about 4 months, so I don't know anything yet. But I was at the Ocean Protection Council and I was staff there for about 10 years. And so there I mostly worked on commercial fisheries issues. And then most recently I worked on some of the issues that were having to do with these unusual events we were seeing in the coast for the past couple of years. So another question, when we roll up. How many of you heard about harmful algal bloom event last year? Yes. Oh, good. So, for those maybe that were unfamiliar or that weren't here, that's okay. At the base of the food chain, there is photoplankton, a single cell photosynthetic algae. And the rapid growth of these cells, or one or more of them, can become an algal bloom, sometimes called a red tide. And while some blooms are often harmless or even beneficial to marine ecosystems, some blooms can be indicative of eutrophication or ecosystem destruction, and it can create huge negative impacts throughout the environment. or human health, or the economy. So many of these negative impacts to humans and marine organisms are related to the toxic shellfish ingestion. So at the base of the food chain, you have your oysters, mussels, clams, filter feeding organisms, and then your sardines, and it gets moved up through the food chain that way, and your larger predatory fish, and then sea lions and whales and stuff start eating this stuff. So what made last year's bloom so interesting and impressive was that while its impacts on coastal shellfish were first discovered in the spring of 2015, it maintained its presence for a really long time. Normally, these have to come in for a week or two and then they dissipate. And so also when the newspapers or when things say we had this bloom from California up to Alaska, that isn't actually right. And so you have like hot spots. And so these blooms come and they go. And what made last year's bloom weird was that it didn't go. It stayed and it stayed and it stayed. And so the toxin of concern here was domoic acid. And so that got brought up through the food chain. I'm using my microphone here. So pseudonychia is the neurotoxin that produces domoic acid, and it appeared along the coast from Southern California up through Alaska. And again, the HAB was much larger than it usually is, as I mentioned, and the duration of the bloom was unprecedented. So at the Ocean Protection Council, we've been working with the scientists there, Ray Kudela, who's really great. You guys should get him here to talk. And I steal a lot of his data. So if you're not aware, the Eastern Pacific was also the warmest we've seen it in quite some time, on average about 1 to 4 degrees Celsius or 2 to 7 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than usual. In some places, it's even 9 degrees warmer than usual. And so this warmth, I wanted to point this out. So this is September 27th from 2011. This is the warm blob that you might have heard about. This is last year. You can see how warm it was. And then this is today. So we've cooled down quite a bit, which is good news. But that's weird. That's not normal oceanographic behavior. So I'm going to walk through a bunch of weird events. This is Fort Ross. This was a huge abalone die-off. This is one of the sea stars. In 2013, there was sea star wasting disease that wiped out pretty much all of the sea stars along the west coast. Red tides also create eutrophication, so these were anchovies in Southern California. And so these weird events have sort of become a way of life. Environmental stressors, like I mentioned, in the Sonoma coast, we had that sea star wasting disease. 2013, we had an explosion in the sea urchin population, and the warm water conditions persisted throughout for the past 2 years. It's cooled down now, so that's good. This is Pacific Road. These are red crabs that pulled up. Sea's obviously starving, mammals not happy. And you can see 2015, we had record strandings of sea lions. We also had yellow belly venomous sea snakes washing up on the shore of Southern California.
Right.
That's not normal. We had whales. So the other weird thing that we still haven't figured out was everything got sort of condensed along the coast. Usually whales, anchovies, sardines, it sort of spread out throughout the coast. It was pretty narrowly compacted last year. Everything was, it was good for wildlife viewing, and you could see whales from the beach, so that's kind of cool, but that's not normal. This slide actually is one of the things that most concerns me. This is our kelp cover, and this is Northern California. And so I mentioned these large-scale catastrophic events, they sort of combined into this perfect storm of ecological impacts, and it triggered these dramatic shifts in the kelp forest ecosystem along the North Coast. So the North Coast has been pretty much reduced to all-time lows. The Department of Fish and Wildlife, I mentioned, those are the managers. They do annual surveys in Sonoma and Mendocino County since 1990, and their observations of kelp are at an all-time low. So all of those cascading issues that I mentioned, the reduction in the kelp has already impacted the red abalone fishery and the commercial red sea urchin fishery. So I mentioned the urchins the population has increased dramatically. They've eaten everything. And so you have starving abalone, and you have starving sea urchins, but the urchins, for whatever reason, are hardier. They can survive a lot longer without eating anything. This is a starving abalone, so this is its foot. Its foot should be the size of the shell. So this is a starving guy. And this is not normal behavior. They don't normally climb up kelp fronds. So the other big story of the domoic acid situation in the warm water in the ocean was the toxins in the California fisheries. So primarily the Dungeness crab fishery, which you probably heard about, got shut down last year. And so they're here. This is again, I'm stealing from Rafe. This is the threshold limit, the FDA threshold limit for parts per million of domoic acid. And these were primarily what we were sampling. This is 1,000 parts per million. That would kill you if you ate it, and that was in the meat. And the other weird thing about how this domoic acid event presented itself was that it stayed in the meat. And again, normally it's in the viscera. Now, if you're paying attention from public health, you'll see recommendations to just remove the viscera before you eat it or cook it. Last year, it was staying in the meat for weeks on end, and it wasn't going out. Razor clams, we just, at the commission, had to do an emergency closure for razor clams. They're super hot right now. Don't eat them. You'll die. So huge impacts to, again, our identity as Californians. Dungeness crab is a big thing in California. You have chukino at Christmas time or Thanksgiving. It's also a huge economic engine for a lot of California fishermen. And these are small boats. These are the small California fishermen that fish Dungeness crab primarily. This is Fisherman's Wharf, which is actually a Fisherman's Wharf again. But they generate anywhere from $60 to $96 million a year. That's a big fishery for California. It's not big in the federal fisheries world, but it's big for California. And it was closed, the fishery was closed from about 2015 in November to about May. And it put a lot of guys out of work. And this was on top of the salmon season that was really bad too. So you had a lot of guys losing their houses, losing their trucks, and it was bad all around. There's a lot of hearings that we had to participate in to work with the feds on how we were going to try to provide economic assistance to them. And that's still working itself out. What we were finding is that these emergency situations are not well suited to how government moves because we move like the pace of a snail, right? So we can't respond quickly enough to these disasters. It also created new challenges for fishery managers. We don't usually talk to public health officials every week. And so the Department of Fish and Wildlife, the Commission, the Department of Public Health, there's also another agency called the Office of Environmental Health Hazard and Assessment, that's WEHA, for those paying attention, and the Ocean Protection Council were on weekly calls about these toxins and sampling. And we had to coordinate between and we had to rely on fishermen to go out and get samples of crabs to bring them to guys to go and then bring them to there was one lab in California that could do the sampling, just to put this in perspective. And so they went through, I want to say, thousands of samples throughout this duration. So it was a success in the sense no one got sick, no one died from that we heard of from eating crab or anything tainted. But we're not geared up for this sort of thing. And then it generated a ton of questions. So the fishermen started wondering, well, what's the history of domoic acid in California? How often have we seen it? What are the criteria for opening and closing the fishery? How frequently are sites monitored? How are samples collected, and so on? So before I left the Ocean Protection Council, I worked with Ocean Science Trust, and we created this report, essentially a frequently asked questions document on harmful algal blooms. You can get it, I brought a couple copies if you're really interested, but it was an interesting effort in the sense that these were questions from fishermen and from the public members. We responded directly, brought in all the public health experts, domoic acid experts, oceanographers, Ray Kudo was featured in here, and answered their questions about this issue that they knew nothing about. And if you don't know, Ocean Science Trust is the science arm of the Ocean Protection Council, so we have science that directly informs policy, so that's really great. And so this is out, it came out in August, and the next thing that we're working on is a longer term document looking at how warming water and domoic acid, and not just domoic acid, because with the warming water is bringing more toxins that we don't know about, and how that's going to impact the marine food web. So if you reflect back to that whole perfect storm of events of the kelp dying off, the abalone die off, these are huge problems in our marine food web. And so what can we expect in the future? What can we expect in 5 to 10 years from now? And how can we start planning for that? And what is the science that we need to invest in that to help make better informed decisions? I'm not there yet. And this might be a little too nerdy, but so it's interesting to me. At the commission, I mentioned that we're in the cycle of doing these emergency regulations. Emergency regulations are only for 90 days. They're supposed to be emergencies. We have to keep renewing them because the emergency hasn't gone away yet. And so I'll get into this weird discussion about OAL, which will bore you to tears, but Office of Administrative Law doesn't like us to keep renewing emergency regulations. But we can't find a way out of it because there's not a real long-term way to deal with a warming ocean event that we've established before. So we're going to have a whole new set of regulations that addresses this challenge. I guess is the takeaway. So we don't just work on marine issues at the commission, we also work on wildlife. So I want to show you this little video. And so I'll remind you of the mission at the commission, which is to ensure the long-term sustainability of California's fish and wildlife resources for all Californians, and both for its ecological as well as for its use and enjoyment. And so this video was presented, and the two scientists involved were at Wyoming at a conference that I was one of two women at. And there I met these guys who, one of them is a National Geographic fellow, Joe Reese, who's a photographer, and then Arthur Middleton, who just went to UC Berkeley as a research biologist. And they're studying migration patterns in and out of Yellowstone. But this has huge connections to California, and it kind of gets me excited to think about the work that we can do by bringing together people. And there might be a class related to this. Talented enough.
It's 2013. It's 2013, and for large mammals around North America, especially the lower 48, we typically think we kind of know what's going on. And here we have hundreds of animals migrating 150 miles across public and private lands right underneath our noses when we didn't even know about it.
My name's Hal Slater, and I'm a research biologist. I've been studying mule deer in western Wyoming now for more than 15 years. We recently started a mule deer study in the Red Desert of Wyoming, and the study was intended to just document the movement and distribution patterns of what we thought was a non-migratory or resident herd in the desert. But to my surprise and everybody else's, it turns out that most of these deer migrate some 150 miles north to the mountain ranges of northwest Wyoming. This new GPS technology provides us a window into this sort of mysterious process of migration that we've never had before.
When you look at this migration on a map, you say, ooh, wow, these deer moved 150 miles. But it's especially impressive when you actually look at this migration route on the ground and see firsthand the landscape and the obstacles that these animals have to move through. 3 highways, over 100 fences, and multiple reservoir crossings, the river crossings.
My job as a photojournalist working on this project is to show people what deer migration looks like. I want to show people this type of migration footage that gets people to envision what it's like to be an animal, what it's like to be a migrating animal that's moving 100 miles, 200 miles, and try to help people think about these long distance movements. A lot of the areas that I focused on is at the outlets of these lakes called finger lakes. One thing that was really interesting for me is each time I go check the camera, I'd click through and look through the video, and there'd be a lot of vocalizations.
These migration behaviors are learned from mother to offspring, from generation to generation. So deer use the same migration route year after year after year. What we've learned from this is that this incredible migration can take place right under our noses in the year 2012. Thousands of animals moving 150 miles. The fact that this migration still exists in unprotected areas in this day and age is pretty amazing.
So I've got some really cool videos and a lot of cool letters for you to check out. What I like about this video is, along with the cool images, it clearly shows this patchwork of entities involved in protecting a species in a migratory pathway, right? You have public land, you have private land, you have federal land, you have highways, you have underpasses, overpasses, so all this stuff. And so that just makes you think about all of the people that have to be involved in that sort of connection. And so they've done some really cool work, I'll get into it. But who they also reached out to were the hunters. And so if you don't know, I didn't know this before 4 months ago. So there's Pittman Robertson funds. These are funds collected by hunters. So every time you buy a gun, ammo, a hunting license, these funds go directly to fund state and federal wildlife programs. And so you can see the uptick. That's people buying more guns, not necessarily for hunting. Not why we're here. But so this creates a lot of money for wildlife resources. And so the hunters were huge supporters of this project and supported a lot of the cool outcomes of it. And by contrast, the non-consumptive users, I'm sure Jason has told you about it or you'll learn more about it, there's not a direct funding source right now for non-consumptive users to help for wildlife conservation. There's no REI tax, right? So when you go hiking or when you go buy your shoes or your boots or whatever, there's no direct funding source that goes directly to support wildlife conservation. This is the annual hunting license sales. It's been going down. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service estimates that there's about 12.5 million individuals who consider themselves hunters today, down from about 9% in 2001 and 15% in 1996. California, always ahead of the curve, much stronger die-off in hunting participation. However, the interesting thing, the general population's attitude towards hunting, and I want to be clear, this is not for trophy hunting, this is just for sort of normal, you're going to go out and shoot and eat it yourself hunting. People's acceptance of hunting has actually increased over time. And so this is an interesting place to be, especially, I think, with the enhanced knowledge now of how and what we eat, the whole eat organic and local movement, as well as, we know what we eat impacts our health and the health of the environment. So consumption of industrial produced meat is at once both an ethics issue, an environmental injustice issue, a pollution issue, a waste issue, a habitat issue, a climate issue, obviously. We're sure I'm forgetting some. Thus, there's this paradox of a lot of the rebound of many wild species, deer, turkey, geese, black bears, all those populations are doing pretty well, in part due to these Pittman-Robertson funds. But one of the challenges is that most Americans have no idea what to do with these species. We gawk, we feed them, we inadvertently hit them with our cars or remove them in our cars. If you didn't hear about this, these were some tourists at Yellowstone that thought a bison was cold. And they brought it to the rangers. It was a sad story. And so, we're surprised and alarmed by their messy habits and their occasional aggressiveness, and we want them gone from our neighborhoods, but we abhor the idea of killing them. In the book Nature Wars, it's a good book, Jim Sturbia blames our issues here on two main factors, sprawl and sentimentality. His basic premise is that Americans today have lost a connection with nature, that we forget our role in it and how our actions impact wild species. So many of these animals also prefer living in the suburbs. Deer prefer eating our gardens and our lettuce versus moss on the floor of the forest. Birds are excited to have seeds of, they're readily disposable that they can eat. Cats say, what do you to raccoons. Bears, they all learn where the trash cans are. There's a good New York Times article that documented all the raccoon populations in New York City, and they have permanently established colonies, and they have preferred trash locations that they go to. It's fascinating, it's interesting. But very few people have an actual connection with the land, and importantly, how many creatures it can support. And so I don't know if this is from not being out in nature enough or watching a lot of wildlife on TV, but this makes people unwilling to make really difficult choices. So I'm not suggesting we go out and kill Bambis in the woods. What I'm suggesting is that these management of these species is really complicated, and we have to promote economic incentives and behavior that protects and conserves the entire ecosystem, not just to keep Bambis at the woods. And sometimes we have to make difficult decisions. If those purple sea urchin populations are getting out of whack, let's have some uni, you know? If we're decimating all of our native plant species because the deer populations are out of control, venison isn't that bad of an alternative. And importantly, we need to address the root causes of what's causing these imbalances in the first place. We don't want to keep repeating them. Both it's costly, it costs a lot of money, and it's the same thing over and over again. And I think part of getting to these root causes is going to take some rethinking about certain beliefs among everyone. So whether you're someone who believes that it's wrong to personally kill animals, or if you think that hunting is somehow only the cultural identity of guys with big trucks and who only vote for Republicans, we have to challenge that thinking. Perhaps the idea of the red state hunter has held back many people who might try hunting and find it a good solution to their ethical and environmental issues. Conversely, it's true on the same other side, the guys with the big trucks, they're willing to try tofu. It's the same thing. So yes, lots of hunters are conservatives, but many political conservatives are also ethical environmental hunters who deeply respect the animals and the habitats that they hunt on. And the same is true of liberals. You know, are liberals only tofu-eating Patagonia hikers that Instagram or hikes? No, there's much more nuance than that. So remember, the idea of conservation as a policy, and I want to be clear, conservation as a policy in America began by hunters. Yellowstone was first envisioned as a giant game reserve that, as it spilled out over the edges, you would have these abilities for hunters to go out and nab sort of the overpopulation. Sort of like how we're talking about our marine protected areas. That's one of the ideas for the commercial fishermen. We'll grow our habitats so we have more fish to fish for. Our first conservation-minded president, Teddy Roosevelt, was a huge hunter. And those hook and bullet organizations, those funds, supply a lot of funding to actually supply wildlife conservation and preservation of land and habitats. So, you see, the thing about hunting is that you need nature to go hunting in it. And hunters, both liberal and conservative, generally like nature. And that's why they're out there in it. And we have to build on that connection. In 2015, over 2 million licensed hunters and anglers supported about 90 million towards fish and wildlife management and conservation of activities in this state. Fish and wildlife management and conservation activities have resulted in numerous success stories. So this is part of the Wyoming study so Joe took all these pictures, and so he was finding these, the migration was having to go through, I think it was Interstate 80, and so they ended up doing a wildlife overpass. And for whatever reason, this costs a ton of money. It's like $50 million to do a little bridge. But first of all, it saves people's lives, and then it saves the lives of all the animals. And it's not just the elk or the deer that are migrating through. All the animals end up using these wildlife passages. So it's a great success story. And so getting out and supporting nature can't just be a blue state or a red state thing. One of the many problems in mammal management is that a lot of hunters, they only want to hunt for the big trophy animals, right? And that doesn't necessarily reduce the deer population. We need to go out and kill the does so you don't have as many fawns, right? So that's one of the challenges there. And on the environmental and ethical side of things, if you do eat meat, eating wild game is a much healthier alternative for you than eating animals that have been confined in small enclosures and doused with antibiotics and antidepressants. Wild birds and mammals have been eating a much wider variety of foods that are healthier for you than corn and soy and trash. It's not fed grain that's used excessive water, land, fossil fuels to grow fertilizer. They're not clustered in concentrated animal feeding lots, and they don't produce toxins of lagoons of manure and pools of that. It doesn't impact our water. Eating animals you hunt yourself is also a more ethical alternative than eating those in the industrial agriculture system because you're not outsourcing their deaths to some probably migrant or some person who's underpaid to slaughter that animal. So if you can't do it yourself, I suggest You get recipes from Jason about a vegan lifestyle. And last, in California, we're also having more and more wildlife interactions. So for example, in Los Angeles, there's about 5,000 coyotes living down there now. And so concern over personal safety and number of attacks on people is on the rise. And so in the LA Times, there was recently an article from a student who talked about how he was frightened by this. And he thought it was unfortunate that pets and people were going to get attacked. And he thought what the solution should be was that they should put a fence around the area so that you could keep, the coyotes out and they wouldn't have to go hunt for food. So this tells me a lot of that we need to do a lot more education, right? You can't put a fence around LA. Much as Trump was being like, it's not going to work. It's not going to. Coyotes are also pretty wily, right? They can figure stuff out. They're smart, and they like that. They like this area. This is easy food for them. So we need to really figure out these solutions and work on this together. And we can probably figure out what's happening here too. Sprawl makes the coyotes' habitat closer to people, and so we're building homes closer and closer to their natural habitat. Therefore, we're encroaching on their territory. Warmer weather, lack of rain, wildfires have caused their preferred habitat to become scarce. And so now they're used to living in open urban areas. They use the freeways, the gutters, the streets as a means of travel. Garbage cans, pet food left outside swimming pools. You maybe saw the bear in someone's swimming pool in LA this summer. That's a really common occurrence. And with any wildlife issue, remember that bell curve, we get people at the commission at every end of the spectrum on that issue that comes to the meetings. And so you have your people that hate it or people that love it. But we really need to work on that middle part of getting people together to figure out how to solve these issues. And so we need the hunter and the animal rights activists both to be heard and both to be listened to. And we have to figure out also how to educate people that putting a fence around LA isn't really possible. And it's not going to solve the problem. It requires patience, time, and money. And so obviously a lot of people don't have that time to devote to it. So in closing, when asked what I think the challenges are for the future of California, we're going to have to deal with some really complex problems of identity. And so I'm really concerned about climate change. If you look at the science of what's happening and you're not worried, then I'm not sure you understand the data. And regardless if you think of climate, if it's warming because of people or not, the climate is actually warming, right? And so it's going to have impacts to fish, wildlife, and resources. And so we have to answer some tough questions, What is our vision of California? What is our identity of the ocean? How do we identify as Californians? How do you identify like that? And what do you think we can come to the middle on here? I'm not trying to suggest these questions even have answers. It's just that we need to figure them out. And so I'm sort of reminded of Einstein's quote that we can't solve these problems with the same thinking that we used when we created them. And here at NIST, I want to bring it back here, you join, I think, a multitude of really thoughtful, caring people throughout the world. And so you have a unique ability to really talk to people across the world about these issues. Whether it's climate change, poverty, deforestation, water, hunger, human rights, the environmental movement, they really should be seeking connection and seeking how we can work with each other on things. So my husband is here tonight. We have this lovely 5-year-old little daughter. Her name's Caroline. And as any bad parent, we watch a lot of TV. Well, not a lot. So we've been watching some Daniel Tiger. Again, I'm going to date myself. Those who don't know Daniel Tiger, it's the new Mr. Rogers neighborhood. It's great. But in one of the episodes, it's some bad things happen. There's a big storm, and there's power goes out, and there's all sorts of problems. And this is based on a Fred Rogers quote. He says, when any bad things happen, look for the helpers. And I think you guys are those helpers, right? We're helping. We're trying to figure out how to help the world get to a better place, and it's going to require connection. It's going to require talking to people that you don't automatically think that you have anything in common with. It's going to require talking to people in big trucks that vote for Trump. It's going to require talking to people in Russia, in Pakistan, in China, and that's how we're going to solve this problem. So I'm excited that I'm here because I think this is a great school and a great opportunity to do these sorts of things, and so thank you for having me. And you can take any questions that you may have.
Turn the lights on, Valerie. Where's the company? Yeah, that's good. Can I start out with 2 questions? Would you turn this off? So, you were kind of hinting at the need for kind of different kind of regulatory response, even in this, especially when you're talking about the emergency, right? Kind of a continual emergency, right? And that's, I like to joke, we're having multiple 5-year, 100-year floods every year, right? So it's like the old architecture for thinking about risk is kind of outdated now in this new era. And so what are your thoughts on what type of new policy responses, what are the institutions and the frameworks that can be more adaptive and nimble in this new reality?
Well, I think there's a lot, and obviously California's sort of test bed for these sorts of things. So we have the leeway to sort of try things, and we failed a lot too. But at the Ocean Protection Council, we're trying to invest in a lot of the science that's needed. And the Secretary of Resources, he's great. He gets mad though because he wants to do something. He wants to solve the problem already. He doesn't want to invest more money in science, but it's catch-22, right? You need science to inform the policy. But so we're working on ocean acidification, and we're finding that if you can reduce local stressors to non-point source pollution, that's impacting acidification rates locally, and that's a very small step. There's a whole big report that was just released by the Ocean Protection Council and Ocean Science Trust on ocean acidification, and it's a blue panel report. It has a fancy title, I forget exactly. But it lays out a bunch of different policies and investments that the state and the West Coast is looking to make to try to get to, at least locally, and by locally I mean the West Coast, sort of get at the acidification issue and see if we can address that. It's not going to address the broader issue of acidification broadly, but maybe there's a way we can work on it locally. And I think there's a lot of innovation. There's a lot of shellfish aquaculture firms that are trying things differently, whether it's an enclosed system or stuff like that, to see how they try different species that they can grow. That's something. And then also the emergency management systems, they have to be brought into sort of everyday planning. And Michael was just talking about this on our way down, and that in all of our all of our city planning and county planning, the emergencies that keep happening, those 5-year floods that keep happening over and over again, that needs to be brought into how we're thinking about planning for our communities in the future, because as you mentioned, it just keeps happening over and over again. And I don't know how to get out of the OAL cycle of those emergency regulations. We're going to have to do something, because you can only have an emergency for 180 days. So we have to figure that out soon. So it's probably changing laws, but it's messy.
And then real quick, the second question is about, you were saying it was actually all this money from firearms and kind of the licenses. It seems like hundreds of millions, and it seems like that, because you said there's no REI tax or no tent tax or whatever, that it's maybe the political is a little more towards that source of revenue. Is there any thought or at all ideas about how to get the more non-consumptive, the kind of hikers and wildlife viewer backpackers? Right, but what would be the mechanism, right? And how would it work?
So that's good. We're thinking about that, because we're sort of in a deficit at the state for natural resource management and for wildlife, and we would like to have a broader spectrum represented, because we have, I think, 40 million Californians, right, close to, and like I mentioned, there's only 12.5 million hunters across the United States, and so why are they disproportionately sharing the cost for something that we all enjoy? So we're thinking essentially an REI tax, something like that, to help fund state wildlife programs and preservation, and to also get us out of the bond cycle. The bond cycle isn't a really good long-term solution for financing these sorts of things. We need something that's pretty consistent and stable, and that isn't like a boom and bust, like, oh, we have money, oh, we have no money, oh, we have money.
Yeah, maybe that's a project if you're interested. Later on, maybe we get some students working on that. That'd be cool.
I guess what's kind of been your experience trying to get all of these stakeholders with, individual beliefs, but then also kind of a common goal that they might not see? Do you have any stories? Or
it takes a long time.
Yeah.
So I've only been at the commission for 4 months, so I don't really have a lot of experience to share there. But commercial fishermen are pretty salty, and they don't generally like hippies. So when I first started working with them, you sort of had to prove yourself and work with them over and over again. And also take something that they identify with and make it real to them. So a long time ago, maybe 7 years ago, we started the Central Coast Groundfish Program, and the Nature Conservancy bought up a lot of the, so that, I'm going to try to make this simple. So the Sablefish Fishery is a federal fishery, is managed in an individual transferable quota, and the Nature Conservancy bought up a lot of that quota share, and they were leasing it back to fishermen that wanted to try to fish more sustainably. So it was previously a ground trawl fishery, and so the fishermen were really quite angry. And so a couple of the guys, much to their chagrin, decided to try it, and they ended up doing better. So they were catching a much higher quality fish because they were using this light rope kind of gear that didn't impact the fish as much, and so they could sell it for a higher quality sort of product. And then they were also marketing it. TNC was helping market it, as a local sustainable product, and that they could charge more money for it that way. So obviously the money helped, but that helped sort of turn the tide. This was in Morro Bay, and Morro Bay is doing really well now as a local, and they have a pretty diverse portfolio of fisheries that they're fishing for now too. So they're not in that boom and bust cycle too. And so again, kind of providing that stable long-term funding source for them has been really helpful. And that's hard getting there. It requires meetings, it requires, having fishermen come in, they hate meetings. But if you can make it real to them and show them, they also like consistency. So that's one of the challenges with how weird the ocean's been recently. They want to know in 5 years, am I going to be able to go fish for Dungeness crab? And we're trying to invest in that science to be able to tell them, but the prediction software just isn't there yet. We don't know yet. So, we're trying, but it's a process.
Sure. First, thank you so much for coming in. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
I have 2 questions, one very simple, I think, and one probably very not. The simple one, I've seen images of those bridges over for migratory species. Is that a viable thing? Do the animals figure that out?
Yeah, it's great. There's one in Davis for frogs. It's awesome. And I don't know why they cost so much money. I mean, I guess we can all figure that out. But yeah, they work really well. Animals figure it out really quickly, and it saves human lives. It saves animals' lives. It's like a win-win situation for everybody. They're great. But they cost a lot of money, and you've got to get, the transportation system people on board, which is sometimes challenging.
It's incredible that they put that into their...
Well, and so what I think is cool about that, maybe I wasn't clear, so, Joe did this whole photography thing, and he made it really clear about these deer can't get through. And the people might have been saying that for years, but with the photography and with the video, it made it really personal to people. And so then they wanted to devote money to it. They made it into a story, and so people cared about it.
I have a slideshow on the bridges I'll show in class in a couple weeks.
Yeah, there's some in California we're putting up. I can get you info on that.
You had another question though, right?
I did, and this is kind of, I haven't quite worded it entirely, but I would love your perspective on what is the state doing for salmon recovery efforts that is viable and
Salmon?
Yes. I've looked at it at a community level, but I haven't really looked at the state's priorities with it. So I'd love to know just your perspective on what's working, what isn't, and also what you think the role of hatcheries is in the future, or where you're going to start getting rid of those finally, or what?
So that's a hard question.
Yeah.
I can tell you, so back when I was at the Ocean Protection Council, I had an executive director who was making my age at the time, and he was like, let's solve the salmon problem. And I was like, great, let's do that. And so we failed miserably, obviously. What we tried to do is bring together the Indian Native American communities, the fishermen, and the scientists and the water people, and no one would agree. And we were also way too broad. We weren't, I think, focusing down at the community level. And I think that's actually what is working. There's a gentleman, Michael Bowen, who works at the State Coastal Conservancy, who's done some really good work. And I think what does work is river by river working on it, removing barriers, and so you have to involve a ton of agencies involved with that, both federal and state. There's huge barriers to migration, obviously, and just getting Caltrans to even know where they are is sometimes a huge challenge. I can send you a ton of data, but those sort of smaller scale projects, I think, is what is working. On a broader scale, the director of Fish and Wildlife, Chuck Bonham, recently just negotiated the Klamath Dam removal project. So 4 of the 5 Klamath dams are going to be removed. And we also just got word this week that FERC, the licensing entity, is moving all of those licenses to another agency for the insurance purposes, and it's basically a big bought off that they're going to be removed. So that's taken a lot of work. That like is his whole life. But that's huge, and that's huge for salmon and scale that migration.
Thank you.
So, go ahead, you had your hand up first.
First, thank you so much for such a great talk. It was really wonderful. I had a quick question about the government being constrained in moving at a snail's pace, or like you mentioned, and how can the rapid responses that we'll need from climate change be really happening with the current data streams that we have? Often paper fish tickets, things like that.
We're working on paper fish tickets. We're going to have electronic logbooks this year.
Okay, could you explain a little bit more about
We've been working on that for 10 years. I mean, it's hard, right? You have to get money. The state doesn't have money. And you have to also, I mean, just the paper ticket thing, let's just take that as an example.
What is that?
So fishermen, when they land their fish, they write it literally on paper, and then they send it to these little lovely ladies in Los Alamitos at the Department of Fish and Wildlife office who enter it manually into the computer. And that's how you get your landings data for the entire year. California, the hotbed of innovation that it is just this year moving to an electronic system so the guys can just use their iPhone and say, I caught 10 ground fish or 5, whatever. But so part of the problem there was the state's IT system. We don't like other systems. It's tough to have security around it. We're not very flexible on how, like, okay, if this guy has an app, how is that going to interface with the state? Like, there's all of these security issues that come up, and that's just these practical sort of barriers to being innovative at the state. So that's just one challenge. Having said that, we've figured out some wiggle room. Like I mentioned, the Ocean Protection Council has a science arm, Ocean Science Trust. So they're a quasi-state entity. So they're written into the statute as our science arm, so we can work directly with them. But they're not subject to all of the stuff that we are. So they can invest, we can give them money to invest in a lot of the science. They can get out stuff quickly. They can hire people quickly. It has to be directly related to the statutes that created the Ocean Protection Council. But that's a much more flexible way of addressing at least the science issue that the OPC has figured out. And so I think it's going to take sort of creative solutions like that to think through what are the goals too that you want to get to at the end of the day. Is it you want an electronic landing system because that's really much more efficient? Or, is it you want a database on where all of the barriers are for salmon migration, right? So it's just trying to figure out what you want and how to get there and figure out the solution to get there. But the state has a lot of barriers in the way that makes it challenging, and that's why it's slow.
This, the demolic acid is a result of the red algae, and then that's a result of what normally?
Well, so
the high temperatures may last longer, but usually is it runoff?
We don't know that. So
Okay.
that's part of that work that we want to work on in that report that I alluded to. So we think a lot of the warming water led to the increase of the bloom, which led to the pseudomycia, or the demolic acid bloom. So with warming water, you can get lots of other toxins, some that we don't even know about yet. And so what we're also finding is in the sediment, it's staying there. And so there's some hot spots around California. So the Channel Islands has this weird hot spot, so everything is always really hot there. Up north in Fort Bragg, there's a tiny little hot spot. And so we just don't have the data yet. It's starting to come in. We kept seeing this last year with these areas when we were doing sampling for crab or fish or whatever, they were staying sticky. And we don't know why, but it's in the sediment and it hasn't dissipated. And previously it did.
But I mean, what makes, in normal years, what makes the algae appear? Is it runoff?
It's the warm water creates the blooms of like when it's springtime, you get blooms of flowers and everything.
So it usually happens, it's just.
But it dissipates away. Think about, the fog and the upwelling of the coastal ecosystem here, it flushes out, so to speak. And that's why it typically goes away, but the water stayed so warm for so long. And I don't know anything about the sediment, I just know it stayed. there, and it's still there in some spots.
I want to say thank you as well, because not only I learned from Michael, did you drive from Davis, but you made a detour to Sacramento for a meeting and over to Oakland and a conference call on the way down, and 4 months into your new job. You are so busy. Thank you so much for coming here.
It's great to be back.
I had a question about your kelp slide, because when I heard about this kelp die-off, I called some of my phycologist friends. And,
Which is not something we have a lot of data on at the state. We need more of your friends to come talk to us.
Okay, good, because it might be a more hopeful situation, because your kelp slide is like, oh my God, it's all dead. But I think it might just be bull kelp.
It
So
is
I
just bull kelp.
Oh, good, okay, so that,
Not good.
well, no, but our beautiful macrocystis,
Right,
which is the
right.
long
Here.
leafy one
Right
here,
Right now.
is not dying off. Is that right?
Right.
Good.
It's just bull kelp, which is causing purple ocean explosion, which is causing
Which is huge and causing all of that.
impacting the entire food web.
It's bad
But it's
enough.
fine.
Okay, it's still bad.
All right, maybe we'll end it there, and if people want to come and kind of introduce themselves, have a few more words with you. So thanks a lot, Valerie.